Kanye West's latest comments sent shockwaves across social media and the entertainment industry. In a late-night live stream, he made inflammatory remarks about Jewish influence in media and finance, doubling down on old conspiracy theories that had long been debunked. His words spread like wildfire, dominating headlines within hours. Initially, his most devoted fans defended him, claiming he was merely asking questions, but the broader reaction was swift and unforgiving. Civil rights organizations, advocacy groups, and public figures condemned his statements. The Anti-Defamation League issued a scathing response, calling his rhetoric dangerous and historically rooted in anti-Semitic propaganda. Prominent celebrities, many of whom had collaborated with him in the past, distanced themselves from his remarks. Some even publicly regretted their past support of his work. Meanwhile, media outlets dissected his words, replaying clips of his statements alongside historical parallels of how such narratives had fueled discrimination and violence in the past. As the backlash intensified, brands associated with Kanye West found themselves under pressure. Major sponsors of his fashion line, music platforms hosting his albums, and even businesses loosely affiliated with him faced public scrutiny. Social media users called for boycotts, and within days, some brands issued statements reaffirming their commitment to inclusivity in distancing themselves from West's comments. Rather than apologizing or backtracking, Kanye responded in the way he always had, with defiance. He took to social media again, claiming he was being silenced by a powerful elite that didn't want the truth exposed. He presented himself as a martyr, someone willing to speak out even at the cost of his career. He framed the backlash as proof that he was right, reinforcing the conspiracy theories that had put him in hot water in the first place. For a brief moment, his strategy seemed to work. His supporters doubled down, flooding social media with messages about cancel culture and free speech. However, the momentum of his outrage campaign couldn't keep up with the overwhelming rejection he faced from the wider industry. His words were no longer just controversial, they were costing him everything he had built. Mark Zuckerberg had no interest in public feuds, nor did he need to engage in a back-and-forth with Kanye West. He had seen the pattern before, celebrities stirring controversy, banking on the outrage cycle to keep their names relevant. But this time, the stakes were different. West's comments weren't just offensive, they had real-world consequences, stirring up dangerous rhetoric that could fuel division and hatred. Zuckerberg's approach was calculated and precise. He didn't issue public statements denouncing West. There was no need for grandstanding. Instead, he set in motion a quiet but powerful response, one that would make it clear that aligning with hate speech was simply bad for business. Behind the scenes, Meta's advertising division began reaching out to some of the biggest brands in the world. Executives from global corporations were reminded that their ad placements ran alongside West's content on Instagram and Facebook. While there was no outright demand, the message was clear: continued association with such rhetoric came with reputational risks. The response was immediate. Major advertisers, wary of controversy, began quietly pulling their campaigns from any platform still promoting West's brand. The domino effect didn't stop there. Meta's influence extended beyond its own platforms. Spotify, Apple Music, and other streaming services relied heavily on advertising revenue and partnerships with tech giants like Meta to push their premium services. When whispers started circulating that West's ongoing presence on these platforms could pose a problem for advertisers, executives took notice. Some began considering temporary demonetization, while others debated whether his content should be restricted from promotion entirely. West's music catalog, once a lucrative asset that generated millions in royalties, was now a liability. Public pressure had already created waves, but now the economic tide was shifting against him. The brands that had once fought to be aligned with his image were vanishing. Sneaker deals, fashion endorsements, and corporate sponsorships had already been under strain, but now even the digital platforms that fueled his streaming numbers were beginning to distance themselves. Kanye's response was predictable. He ranted on social media, declaring himself a victim of censorship. He accused tech billionaires of conspiring against him, weaving another layer into the web of conspiracies he had already spun. But his words were no longer reaching the audience he once commanded. His posts received fewer engagements, and without the advertising dollars keeping his name in circulation, the algorithms worked against him. Zuckerberg didn't need to silence Kanye. The market did it for him. With each brand that quietly pulled back, with every partnership that dissolved, West's influence waned. He had built an empire on controversy, but now, with no financial backing to sustain it, his relevance was shrinking faster than he could react. Zuckerberg, meanwhile, continued business as usual. He had seen movements rise and fall, controversies flare up and fade away. He knew that West's outrage would eventually burn out, not because people stopped caring, but because outrage alone was not enough to sustain an empire. Without financial support, without a platform amplifying his voice, Kanye West was just another figure shouting into the void. At first, Kanye West refused to acknowledge the financial consequences of his actions. He believed his influence was too great, his fan base too loyal, and his music too legendary for anyone to truly shut him down. But reality didn't bend to his confidence. One by one, the institutions that had once profited from his brand began to step away, not with dramatic public statements, but with the quiet precision of a business world that had decided he was no longer worth the risk. The first blow came when major advertisers pulled out from Meta's platforms, cutting off one of his most powerful tools for promoting his work. Without paid sponsorships or advertising partnerships, engagement on his social media posts began to drop. Without those promotions, fewer eyes were landing on his content. The very algorithm that had once worked to amplify his voice now treated him like any other account, one whose reach depended entirely on organic engagement. The second blow was financial. Streaming numbers, which had always been a reliable source of revenue, began to decline. While West's die-hard fans remained, casual listeners, the ones who actually drove the bulk of streaming profits, were moving away. Playlists that once featured his songs disappeared. Music platforms quietly deprioritized his catalog, making it less likely for new listeners to stumble upon his work. The impact wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Then came the fashion world's rejection. Brands that had once proudly displayed their collaborations with Kanye's name started erasing him from their marketing materials. His previous partners, still reeling from earlier controversies, finalized their exits, ensuring there would be no future deals. His merchandise, once a staple of pop culture, no longer carried the same weight. Resale values plummeted, and retailers discounted remaining stock to rid themselves of unsellable inventory. As the financial losses mounted, Kanye's response was anything but strategic. He turned to social media, where he had always found refuge in controversy, and unleashed a tirade against those he believed were conspiring against him. He named names, called out companies, and framed himself as the latest victim of censorship and cancel culture. He insisted that a hidden hand was at work, manipulating the system to silence him. But the world had already moved on. The energy that once fueled his outbursts no longer held the same weight. His posts didn't go viral the way they used to. Major publications barely covered his rants, and when they did, the focus was on the consequences he had brought upon himself rather than the conspiracies he pushed. While Kanye spiraled publicly, Mark Zuckerberg's response was simple and devastatingly effective. Without engaging in personal attacks or lengthy defenses, he released a brief statement: "Hate is bad business." There was nothing more to say. The financial consequences had spoken for themselves. Kanye West had always believed in his ability to control the narrative. For years, his unpredictability had been his greatest asset. Every controversy, every public outburst, every shocking statement had only strengthened his cultural grip. But now, as his empire crumbled beneath him, he realized too late that this time was different. Desperate to salvage his reputation, he pivoted, claiming he had been misunderstood. He insisted that his words had been taken out of context, twisted by the media to fit a false agenda. He argued that he had never truly meant harm, that he was simply engaging in intellectual discourse, and that his critics were blowing things out of proportion. He framed himself as a free thinker, a misunderstood genius whose only crime was refusing to conform to the mainstream. But the public wasn't interested in his excuses. His past statements, captured in videos, tweets, and live streams, were replayed across major news networks and social media. There was no room for reinterpretation, his words spoke for themselves. Clips of his most inflammatory remarks were juxtaposed with historical footage of similar rhetoric, emphasizing the weight of his comments. Analysts, journalists, and historians broke down his statements with brutal precision, leaving no doubt about the harm they had caused. Late-night talk show hosts turned his downfall into prime entertainment. Satirical segments mocked his contradictions, his attempts at damage control, and his desperate appeals to regain favor. Influencers who once supported him distanced themselves, publicly stating they could no longer defend his actions. Even his most dedicated fans found themselves struggling to justify his behavior. The internet, once his playground, became his battleground. Memes flooded social media, turning his once powerful image into a caricature of failure. Comment sections that once cheered him on were now filled with mockery and disappointment. His attempts to reclaim the narrative only fueled the ridicule. Every justification he posted became ammunition for another wave of backlash. Meanwhile, Mark Zuckerberg remained silent. He had already made his stance clear, and there was no need to engage further. Instead of acknowledging the spectacle unfolding around Kanye, he continued to focus on business as usual. Meta announced new initiatives aimed at promoting inclusivity in ethical business practices, reinforcing the idea that the future belonged to those who fostered positive social impact, not those who profited from controversy and division. Without a platform to amplify his voice, without brands willing to back him, and without an audience willing to listen, Kanye found himself in an unfamiliar position, powerless. For years, he had thrived on controversy, but now, his notoriety had turned against him. He had miscalculated the limits of his influence, and the world had made it clear, there was no coming back from this. Kanye West had spent his career building an empire fueled by ego, controversy, and an unshakable belief in his own untouchability. But as his financial empire collapsed around him, he found himself faced with a reality he had never anticipated: he was out of options. His sponsors were gone, his music was losing relevance, and his fashion ventures were crumbling. What had once been an unstoppable cultural force was now a cautionary tale, unfolding in real time. With no financial backing left and no allies willing to defend him, he was forced to issue a public apology. The statement, carefully crafted and delivered with an uncharacteristic restraint, attempted to acknowledge the harm his words had caused. He expressed regret for any offense taken, claimed he had been misinformed, and insisted that his words had not come from a place of malice. The tone was subdued, lacking the bravado that had defined his public persona for decades. But the world had already moved on. The apology was met with skepticism, not sympathy. Major media outlets dissected it as nothing more than an attempt at damage control. It was too little, too late. His words had caused real harm, and the consequences were irreversible. Many of his former business partners refused to re-engage, having already suffered their own reputational damage from previous associations with him. Corporate executives who had once lined up for collaborations now viewed him as a liability. His presence in the fashion world had become radioactive. No brand wanted to risk being linked to a figure whose name had become synonymous with bigotry. Music industry executives, while acknowledging his past influence, had already turned their focus to the next generation of artists, unwilling to gamble on a comeback that would only spark further controversy. Even his die-hard fans, those who had defended him through countless scandals, were growing tired of the cycle. Kanye had spent years cultivating an image of rebellion, but now, he was no longer seen as a misunderstood genius, he was seen as a man who had sabotaged his own legacy. His story became a cautionary tale, dissected in business schools, media ethics courses, and corporate boardrooms. Analysts pointed to his downfall as proof that hate speech wasn't just morally wrong, it was financially unsustainable. Meanwhile, Mark Zuckerberg emerged from the situation untarnished, his approach proving both ethical and effective. He hadn't engaged in personal attacks, hadn't fueled the outrage cycle, and hadn't needed to silence anyone. Instead, he had let the financial consequences unfold naturally, allowing the business world to make the ultimate statement. His leadership was praised for reinforcing the idea that standing against hate wasn't just the right thing to do, it was smart business. In the end, Kanye West had no one left to blame but himself. The controversy he had once wielded as a weapon had finally turned against him. The same system he had claimed was silencing him had simply done what it always did, it moved on. And without its support, he was left behind, a relic of his own self-inflicted downfall.